Good afternoon and welcome to this lunchtime lecture at Burlington House at the Society of Antiquaries of London. Before we begin, I'd like briefly to tell you a little bit about the Society. It was awarded the Royal Charter by George II in 1751, charged with the enhancement, permanent study and knowledge in this and other countries. And it moved to Burlington House in 1874, where we enjoy these marvelous premises in spitting distance, as it were, from other learned societies such as the Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Geographical Society, and the Royal Astronomical Society, to name but a few. Today, we remain focused on those core objectives, and as a registered charity, we are committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we do through lectures like this one today, tours, exhibitions, and publications. Now, in case the unlikely event of a fire alarm, which we're not expecting, but you never know these days, please leave calmly through the main front doors and congregate in front of the statue in the Burlington House courtyard. Those of you at home or work, I'll leave you to follow your own procedures if you have your own. I should introduce myself. I'm Anthony Musson, Head of Research at Historic Royal Palaces and a trustee of the Society. And I'd like to welcome warmly our speaker today, who's Riccardo Neri, a PhD Phil candidate at Mansfield College in Oxford. And he, as you will hear today, is researching British espionage in Italy in the 18th century. And intriguingly, he used to work as an archivist in Tuscany and apparently came across a lot of interesting details in the records there, which then have now encouraged him to come over here and do this DPhil, in which he's in his first year. I'm told this is his first lecture on the subject, and his first actually in English, so, but his English is marvelous, so it'll be fine. Anyway, if I can introduce him, then Riccardo Neri, who will be speaking about art collecting and espionage, Philipp von Stosch in Rome and Florence in the early 18th century. And after the papers, there will be a time for questions. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So yes, this is like my first time giving a lecture in English, so I hope that you will forgive me if I make some mistakes, and I hope that you will enjoy the lecture as well. Today, I'm going to focus about like the links between art collecting and espionage in 18th century Italy through the case of Philipp von Stosch. This lecture comes from my DPhil project, which focuses on the role of British intelligence in Italy during the 18th century, with a particular focus of the cities of Rome and and Florence. I think that this is like a nice topic to focus on, also because I would like to show how British intelligence underpinned the construction of like the modern world and also the British Empire during the 18th century. And also, it is important to know that like the Mediterranean Sea, I'm sorry, was like a very important place. It was like a sort of diplomatic hub due to the particular interest of like Austria, Spain, and also due to the presence of the exiled Stuart court in Italy since 1719. The case of Stosch, it's like an illuminating case study because he was like a very famous antiquarian and he was appointed as a British informal agent in 1722, but we're gonna see that later on. So before concentrating on his life and his espionage activities, I would like to give you a brief introduction of what was like British foreign policy back in the 18th century. We're going to tell about like the 50 years that separate the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So during this period, like Britain became like the most powerful nation in the world. And also, as you can see, Britain was involved like in many conflicts. And during these conflicts, it used also like diplomatic and espionage activities to pursue its like national interests. And the main threat during this period was like the Jacobitism. I think that you know like who were the Jacobites, so the supporters for a Stuart restoration. And so once again, I am pointing you like the role of the city of Rome of particular significance for Britain at that time. And also during this period, like many of the wars that Britain fought were against Spain, because actually this was like the century in which Spain lost like many of its territorial possession in Europe. And I am talking about like in the Northern Europe, the Flanders, and also in Italy, Milan, Naples, and the island of Sicily. So during these 50 years, the guiding principle of like British foreign policy was the balance of power. Essentially, it consisted of like the diplomatic predominance in the continent that was able to give like Britain the possibility to enhance like his overseas dominions and its trades as well. So Britain tried to maintain the equilibrium between like the most powerful nations in Europe in order to defend and pursue its national interests. Historians say that like Britain was able to become like the most powerful country during this period of time because it was like pursuing national interest rather than like dynasty interests. Because we know that like at that time, the most important dynasties were like the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of Spain. Also, I put like point number 2 because Britain tried to keep like separated the crowns of Spain and France, because I think that, you know, both of these nations were ruled by the Bourbons, even though like the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 established that like the European powers had to maintain the crowns of Spain and France very separated. Jacobitism was like pointed as like the pathological fear of Britain by the historians, because the Jacobites tried for many times, at least 3, to came back to power and to have back like the throne of Britain and Ireland. The last Jacobite rising was like in 1745, and it ended like the years later with the Battle of Culloden. And point number 4, the sea trades. During this period, like Britain became, in a definitive way, a sort of European power, because I'm going to mention like 3 different dates. In 1704, Britain conquered Gibraltar from the Spain. And so through this like movement, we can say that like Britain broke the traditional hegemony in the Mediterranean Sea of Spain and France. 4 years later, in 1708, Britain conquered also the island of Minorca, same from Spain. And in 1713, Britain signed the Treaty of Asiento with Philip V of Spain, which gave Britain access to the most profitable market at that time, which was like the slave trade. So at the end, point number 5, diplomacy and espionage. I told you that like during this period, Britain used diplomacy and espionage in order to advance its national interests. And historians have defined like this period as the pre-modern period of diplomacy and espionage. It's not modern because during the 18th century, those people could not count on like the modern communication systems. But it was like a bit modern in the sense that before I'm speaking about, I don't know, reign of Elizabeth I with Robert Cecil and also Waldegrave, espionage had like this very informal nature in the sense that we had like those ministers, and those ministers were patrons, so they have like many clients, and they were able to collect and gather information through like these individuals. Now, in the first decades of the 18th century, espionage became like a sort of bureaucratic machine. So we can speak about like the state servants. And this was made through different like direction given by Whitehalls. So first of all, in 1724 were established like the position of Regius Professor in history, both at Oxford and at Cambridge. And was purpose was like to train future diplomats and send these people away in the most important course in Europe in order to advance British national interests. Then the government started to make like a wide use of post-interception. And in this sense are very important like two dates, 1711 and 1726, when like the government gave instruction to open and detain all the letters addressed to individuals which were like believed to be engaged in treasonable correspondence. Concerning this point, it is important to remember that the Hanover were also like electors of Hanover, and Hanover was like in the route of like postal exchanges with places such as like the United Provinces, so The Hague, and the Law States were like a very important diplomatic hub. So by the fact that the King of England could also use like his Hanoverian ministers to intercept like this correspondence, this fact gave him like an advance towards like many other powerful reigns, such as, for example, France and Spain. So I already told you about like the bureaucracy. In the 30s, were established like a sort of secret department within the post office. And this department was like followed by like the establishment of a deciphering branch overseen by the secretaries of state. During the 18th century, the secretaries of state were the people like who overseen this sort of activities. There were like two different secretaries of state for the northern and for the southern department. And actually, in the case of, let's say, the Duke of Newcastle that we're going to meet later on, he was for the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, and he was like the link between all the information gathered and fed back to London by these diplomatists and also these informal agents, and the ministers and parliament, so the crown itself. So during the 18th century, the Secretaries of State became like very important politicians also for this kind of activities. Then the last point is like the support that the Freemasonry gave to the Whig Party, because they wanted to like enhance the parliamentary monarchy. And this is of particular significance because historians have defined also the Freemasons as builders of empire, in the sense that many Freemasons were involved in espionage missions, essentially because they had like these huge networks of contacts. So it was like very easy for them to gather and feedback information to the government. So let's speak about Philipp von Stosch. Did you follow me until now? It's okay? Okay, great. So with this PowerPoint, I have divided like the life and the activities of this guy in 3 different periods. So first of all, we're going to talk about like these early years. He was born in Brandenburg, so basically it was like a Prussian. And he went to Frankfurt under Oder to study theology. but he left his, his path of study in order to follow the Prussian ambassador in The Hague, so in the Low States. There he met this guy whose name was Francois Fagel. He was like the director of the Chancellery of the Dutch state, but he was also like a very notable art collector. And this meeting was like very important for Stosch because actually Fagel became his first patron. And through that correspondence that is nowadays preserved in The Hague at the State Archives, we can see like how Stosch collected his first items and so how he became an antiquarian. Then he moved to England in 1712. He went to Cambridge because he was hosted by the famous philologist Richard Bentley. And in this occasion, he was initiated into the Freemasonry. Then he came back on the continent and he went to France in Paris, where he attended the circle of the Duke of Orleans. And this is like very important because the Duke of Orleans was like the regent of France after the death of the Sun King in 1714. So actually, in this context, Stosch was able not only to arrange a vast array of information, but also to meet like the most important collector people and stuff as well. And also he met William Homberg. William Homberg was like the royal chemist. And this is important because later on, as we're going to see, Stosch started his own like production of gems and cameos by virtue of the technique that he learned previously here in France from Homberg. So in 1722, he was tasked with spying on James III, the Old Pretender in Rome. He was tasked by Lord Carteret when he was like in The Hague. Lord Carteret was one of the most prominent politicians in Britain during the 18th century. And actually he was sent to Rome. Why Rome? So Rome was of particular significance because of the Stuarts. So once like, because the Stuarts went there in 1719 as Pope's guests. So basically popes during the 18th century have always like gave their support to the Jacobites and so the Jacobites. And this was actually the reason why Britain had no cardinals inside the College of Cardinals during the 18th century. The only British cardinal was the son of the Old Pretender, so was not useful at all for the Whig party and for the Hanover. And but yeah, in Rome, Britain had no diplomatic representatives as a consequence, of course, as the Glorious Revolution, and also because I remember you that like in 1701, through the Act of Settlement, no more Catholic kings were allowed to sit on the Britain throne. So this was not something that Pope liked, as you can understand. And also the paradox was that like Britain was not represented in Rome, while on the contrary, the Stuarts had like this very strong, close relationship with the Pope, as you can see from the fact that they had like this cardinal, and also they had a consul in the port of Civitavecchia. Civitavecchia was at that time one of the most important free ports in Italy. And so this was like a problem for the British merchants because they asked like so many times the Board of Trade to establish a consul there, because with no representations, of course, they had like troubles in order to enhance their trades in the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah, I come back because this was like Clement XI, the Pope that welcomed for the first time the Stuarts in Rome in 1719. He was portrayed by Pier Leone Ghezzi. Keep in mind this name because we're going to find it like later on. And he was like the author of this pamphlet called David, who is running away from Saul. And basically he was just like portraying the king of England, so the Stuart, as like an exile. So that's why the constant support that the popes gave to the Jacobitism during the 18th century. So once Stosch was sent to Rome in order to pursue like this espionage activities. Of course, he was part of a team. So I'm going to show you who were these people. First of all, the Duke of Newcastle. The Duke of Newcastle was, as I told you, one of the most important politicians during the 18th century. He was a man of Sir Robert Walpole. And he was like appointed Secretary of State for the Southern Department in 1724. And we can say that like during the 30s, he was like the second most important politician in Britain after like Sir Robert Walpole. I told you before that like Britain had no cardinals inside the college, which is true. But actually, there were like some people inside the college, such as like Cardinal Giulio Alberoni and Cardinal Alessandro Albani, who actually were like, they agreed with the British government in many affairs. So they gave like them this information back. Cardinal Giulio Alberoni was like a very interesting figure of the 18th century, because I told you before that like in many of the wars that Britain fought in the 18th century, especially in the very two first decades, were against Spain. So the well-trusted man of Philip V of Spain, so the King of Spain, was Cardinal Giulio Alberoni. So Giulio Alberoni was the man who tried to convince Philip of like the importance for Spain to be like the most powerful country in the Mediterranean Sea. So this is why Spain tried to conquer back both Milan, both Sicily and Naples during the 20s, because of Cardinal Giulio Alberoni. And of course, once like Spain was defeated by the Quadruple Alliance, the first thing that the king did was like to exile his minister. So we find like Cardinal Giulio Alberoni once back in Rome, passing information to Stosch and to the British. Cardinal Alessandro Albani was the nephew of the Pope Clement XI, so the Pope that we saw before, portrayed by Pierleone Ghezzi. And being the cardinal nephew was of particular significance in the sense that he was a sort of prime minister. So basically he had like many information. And also he was like a very notable art collector, Cardinal Alessandro Albani. But in our case, it is like very interesting because he became like a lifelong friendship. I'm so sorry. He became a lifelong friend with Stosch. So nowadays we have like this correspondence in the Vatican State archives and also in Vienna, because Cardinal Alessandro Albani was also like the agent of the empire since the 40s. So basically it was like a double agent for the British with Stosch and with the empire, so with the Habsburgs. And then Philipp von Stosch, alias John Walton, because all the records that I can study and that are nowadays preserved in the National Archives under the State Papers series are assigned as John Walton, because he used to use this name to cover his activities. So once he came to Rome, he ended and published his only work, Pierre Antiquae or Gemmae antiquae caelatae, which actually means like ancient engraved gems. And basically, thanks to this publication, he became like a very famous connoisseur and also like antiquarian, because this is considered as a milestone in the discipline of glyptic, because for the first time, he made a sort of database. What did he do? Actually, he worked on more than 17 gems, more than 70 gems. And basically, he referred all these gems to 4 or 5 authors from the ancient times. So for the first time, like collectors in all of Europe were able to know where these items were and which was like their authors, okay? Their engravers. And actually, it's nice to see that like this book was published in Amsterdam by Bernard Picard. Bernard Picard is like an interesting figure because he was an engraver, and also because he was part of a libertine club, which was called like the Chevalier of de la Jubilation, so the Knights of the Jubilee, let's say, whose member was also like Philipp von Stosch. So basically, thanks to his links with Bernard Picard, we can say that even before becoming a Mason, he was like already gravitating with like this kind of clubs which were considered as libertine, a bit radical, let's say, by the governments and by the church, most of all. So basically, he started two works on engraved gems, and also he commissioned new gems and new intaglios, new cameos to emerging artists. So it is nice to see that he was the patron of many artists, both Italian and German, and also French as well, that later on became very famous. And as you can see, from the slide, I try to collect many of these artworks, these items, which are nowadays preserved in very different public institutions or private collections. As you can see, for example, the Hermitage at St. Petersburg, but also we have many Stosch cameos in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Speaking about Lawrence Nutter, Lawrence Nutter was one of the most important engravers in the 18th century, and he trained with Stosch when he was very young, at a very young age. And in the 1754, he published this treaty about the new technique to engrave gems, because the importance of Stosch was not only that he actually studied all these artworks, but thanks to the expertise that he had learned before at the court of Duke Orleans with Homberg, the chemist, he was also able to produce new items. So basically, he started a new technique to produce engraved gems and cameos, which was later on enhanced by these artists such as Lawrence Nutter. Lawrence Nutter also was praised by Goethe, and actually he was later on employed as engraver at the English Royal Mint. And also we know that we have two or three coins, seals engraved by Lawrence Nutter, describing Sir Robert Walpole. So among these artists, there was also Pier Leone Ghezzi. Pier Leone Ghezzi, I remember you was the author of the portrait of the Clement XI that we saw before. Here he's represented on the left with a self-portrait, and on the right he was the author of the image that was at the very beginning of this presentation. So that this is the portrait of Philipp von Stosch with a man holding a flask. Philipp von Stosch was a very fashionable and also a bit strange guy, because he used to dress a bit fancy for that time, and also he was involved in this he attended many balls, so he was actually a man of fashion as well at the courts of Rome and Florence, in both cases. Anyway, so Pier Leone Ghezzi was one of the artists that Stosch used to produce drawings, because Stosch loved not only intaglios and cameos, but also drawings. He started to collect this more than 2,000 drawings illustrating Rome, illustrating also the most important people in Rome. And these are some caricatures from Pier Leone Ghezzi, that we can find inside these memoirs of the knight Pier Leone Ghezzi, which is a manuscript preserved in Biblioteca Casanatense in Rome. I think that you know many of these people, for example, Antonio Vivaldi, a very famous composer. And among these people, I just keep in mind Antonio Niccolini on the right side, because Niccolini was not so famous. He was a scholar from Florence. He became very close friends of Stosch in Rome, but we're gonna see him once again in Stosch, because he was also a British informal agent. So Stosch had access to this market, because actually in the very first decades of the 18th century, Rome was the most prominent market of antiques in Europe, also because there were many excavations ongoing. So the case of Diogenes relief is of particular significance because it says us how Stosch was managing his affairs within like these collector circles. So this marble was like found during the excavation in Monte Testaccio, which was like a place in the center of Rome in 1627. And actually, it was purchased by Pier Leone Ghezzi while he was like drinking in Testaccio, because you have to know that like Testaccio was also like very famous for its wine cellars. So it's also nice to try to imagine like these people doing things back in the days, because they were like so funny in a sense, no? And also he sell back this marble relief to Philipp von Stosch, who did what? He actually restored it, because now there is like a different conception of like being an art collector, because like in the very early stage, so in the 18th century, being an art collector meant that you were also able to put your hands like in these artworks and to restore these things on your desire, which is something that like nowadays is not so easy to do, or you should not do that at all. Anyway, this is like nice because we have like many records describing this case. I mean, this discover, because like, for example, Pier Leone Ghezzi inside a manuscript, which is like nowadays housed in the Vatican Library, portrayed this marble relief, but without the Diogenes head and without like the figure of Alexander. Of course, this is illustrating the famous episode of Diogenes meeting Alexander the Great. And what did Stosch did? What did Stosch do? He put like the head of Diogenes using this marble statue of Villa Albani, which was like the house of Cardinal Alessandro Albani, and once again the links with the cardinals and the other double agents. And also he put like inside this figure of Alexander. But in order to present himself as like a restorer of this ancient artwork to the collecting circle, and I mean, in order to bolster his own reputation, he commissioned like two works. The first one, same to Pier Leone Ghezzi, it's like a portrait of Diogenes and Alexander. So once again, this episode in which he put himself, because I circled that guy, and that guy is actually Philipp von Stosch. So as a patron, I mean, he paid for that, so he was allowed to put himself on the painting. Also, he commissioned to François Marteau, it was like a French engraver, this medal with like his figure on one side, and on the other side, same the episode as well. And on top, on the right side, I put you like an image from like a successive publication, because this is like Winkelmann. I think that you know Joachim Winkelmann, one of the most famous art historian, and we're gonna meet him later. But actually, he published this book about like antiquities in Rome in 1760, in which he also discussed and described like the marble bas-relief restored by Philipp von Stosch. So, Stosch in Florence. Are you following me? It's okay? Okay, great. In 1731, Stosch was sent to Florence, because actually we can say that he was like discovered by the Stuart's counter-espionage, at the point that like many contemporaries already knew about like his espionage activities. Like, for example, in 1729, Montesquieu came to visit Rome, and he wrote like in his letters, there is here Baron Stosch, but everybody knows that he is like an espion, so a spy on behalf of King George. So Stosch was like forced to leave Rome on February 1731 after an attempt upon his life. And it's funny because once he described this episode to the Duke of Newcastle, he said that like this man are the men from the Cardinal Acquaviva. He was like a Spanish cardinal. And he said, yes, but I don't think that they were like Italians, because if they were Italians, I was already dead. So he was lucky because they were like these killers. So basically, he was able to leave the city, and then he was sent to Florence. But why Florence? This is, in any case, like the last Grand Duke of Florence of the Medici dynasty, Gian Gastone, who died in 1736. So why Tuscany? Tuscany was like very important because of many reasons. And actually, Tuscany was not like a backwater in the British diplomacy of the 18th century, but a very important diplomatic hub. First of all, was like the closest court to Rome, where I remember you that there were like no British diplomatic representatives. So actually was like the closest place to have information about the Stuarts in Italy. Then it was like very important because of the intense commercial activity of the free port of Leghorn, which was like dominated by a greater extent by British traders. Leghorn was one of the most important ports in Italy, and I remember the port of Civitavecchia. So actually Leghorn was important for British because they had no access to Civitavecchia, so that they turned their affairs and trade exchanges to Leghorn, which is like represented there in an ancient map from the 18th century. And also, I mean, actually the main reason why Stosch was sent to Florence was because of the continuing struggle over Tuscany between the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of Spain, which became a common European concern after the death of the last Medici Grand Duke in 1736. Because in this case, once again, the balance of power. At the very beginning, during the first 2 decades of the 18th century, Tuscany was promised to the Spaniards, so to the Spanish people, because he was promised to Don Carlos. Don Carlos, who was the son of Philip V of Spain and Elisabetta Farnese. But actually, in 1734, Don Carlos conquered the kingdom of Naples in the south of Italy. So Britain, in order to maintain the balance of power even in Italy, gave, at the end of the War of Polish Succession in 1738, with the Treaty of Vienna, Tuscany to the Habsburgs. And so basically, Britain succeeded to establish in Italy a balance of power which persisted until like the unification of the Italian peninsula in the 18th century, in the 19th century, I'm sorry, with the only exception of the Napoleonic era, of course, because he came to Italy, and let's say that he made a mess. So, once again, in order to collect information, you need to be part of a team, because you're not able to do that like on your own. So once again, on top, we find like the Duke of Newcastle. But this time, fortunately, Britain had like his resident minister in Florence, whose name was Sir Horace Mann. Sir Horace Mann was a British envoy in Tuscany from 1738 to 1786, which was like very impressive because, for what I know, it was like the diplomat who stayed in charge for the longest period of time during the 18th century, which means that he made a very good job, I think. And also, it was like very famous because he was an art collector as well, and he was like a man of fashion. Let's say that, like, for example, when Gibbon, the historian Edward Gibbon, came to his grand tour in Italy, he wrote that Sir Horace Mann, like most serious business, was entertaining the English at his hospitable table. But actually, he was like very good because behind the scenes, he was acting as a spy master. And once again, Antonio Niccolini, we met him before. Antonio Niccolini, now I can give you like more details about him so that you can understand why he was why he was important on a British perspective. Antonio Niccolini was both a spy and a Mason, And also he came to England from 1746 to 1748 to be trained in like British affairs. He was like very close to the Prince of Wales, and he attended like many times the courts of St. James Palace. And also he was appointed as member of the Royal Society by Martin Foulkes in 1755. So he knew the British perspective. And it is nice because we have like this correspondence with Sir Horace Walpole, the son of Sir Robert, and Horace Mann, in which they discuss about like Antonio Niccolini. It seems that once he was in Britain, nobody liked him, because Horace Walpole said that he turns his little talent to a great account. But actually, it is nice because Niccolini was like the first Tuscan scholar that actually went to England, to Britain, in which he discovered like a different way to rule, so a different government, a parliamentary monarchy. So basically, once he came back and once he was like appointed as a politician in Tuscany, he was like very helpful because he contributed to like a new sort of vibe in the Tuscan political affairs because of the experience that he might read like in Britain. And at the end, Philipp von Stosch, but this time he was like used to sign his reports as Cyclops. So yeah, he changed his name. He was like no more John Walton, but now it's like Cyclops. So Florence, Tuscany. Florence was like a very fashionable tourist destination. Not only from a British perspective, but like many scholars and savants and connoisseurs like in Europe went for the grand tours, as I think that you will know. And we can say about like, I mean, I use this British invasion because I like British music, and this is like a sort of reference to the British invasion about pop, not during the 90s, but doesn't matter. Anyway, like Oasis, Blur, and all these bands. Anyway, I quoted here like some letters between Horace Mann and Horace Walpole in the first two cases, in which basically it is nice to see that like there were like more and more British people and English people like in Florence. And it's nice because when they are like a bit strange, Horace Mann says that they used to go to Stosch place, because at this point, through the examination of the correspondence, it seems that like nobody likes Stosch anymore, because Stosch was like a bit strange in many cases. Sometimes he was just like forced to leave because he was not actually a very good spy, to be honest. But but this is like very important because of the last quote. This is like a letter from Giulio Rucellai to the Count of Richcourt, who was like Giulio Rucellai. He was the minister in charge for the ecclesiastical affairs in Tuscany, and now we're gonna see why. And basically he said that like the British are dangerous, but in which sense? To the prime minister, the Count of Richcourt. Why you were so dangerous from our perspective? Because essentially you brought like, the British brought like so many new things in Italy and in Tuscany in this case, such as like the Freemasonry. So what does it mean? It means that like these spies, because we have to know that like Philipp von Stosch was like the founder of the first Italian Masonic lodge in 1731, along with Charles Sackville. And basically, Charles Sackville was like the second Duke of Dorset and later on the Earl of Middlesex. Actually, they brought like this new form of sociability, which was like something very different for what we had like before in Tuscany. And so basically, this was like something that the church didn't like at all, because in 1738, through the bull In Eminenti Apostolato, the Pope excommunicated the Freemasons. essentially because they used to embody like British cultural values, such as like perhaps tolerance or meritocracy or constitutional authority, all things that was like seen as dangerous, not only from an ecclesiastical point of view, but also from the government. And another point that I would like to underline is like the last paragraph in which I talk about like the books, because when we think about the Enlightenment and when we think about the Enlightenment from an Italian perspective, we always think that were the French that brought these new ideas, no? We think about Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, and so on. But actually, there was like another kind of enlightenment, which was made of political pamphlet, parliamentary discussions, and a certain type of publications that actually came with the British. And so it is nice to see that like Stosch used to import like these banned books because I remember you that there was like this index made by the Pope. So there were like books who were still forbidden, but Stosch used to import these new publications from like the United Provinces, from Britain, from France as well, through the free port of Leghorn, which was like dominated by British. And so basically this was considered as like a threat, no, by the church and by the government itself. But the paradox is that like even the Grand Duke of Tuscany was like a Mason because he was initiated into Freemasonry. I'm speaking about like Francis Stephen of Lorraine. He was initiated to Freemasonry in The Hague in 1731. But actually, I mean, let's say that to summarize, it was not so easy to rule over like a pre-unitarian Italian state that was very close to Rome. So basically, he was forced to adopt a politic of balance. So he made like some very huge satisfy toward like the Catholic churches, such as, for example, the general trial against the Masons in 1739. So even though he was a Mason, he was forced to persecute the first English Masonic lodge in Florence because of the intervention of the Catholic Church. Also, the Prince of Craon was like a member, Sir Horace Mann, of course, Charles Sackville, which was like in Italy during his grand tour from 1731 to 1733. Antonio Cocchi, I don't know if you know him, but Antonio Cocchi was like a professor of philosophy at the University of Pisa. He was like the physician of the Grand Duke, and actually he was like a very close friend with Newton. We have like the correspondence with Sir Isaac Newton, and also he was appointed member of the Royal Society in 1755. So you can see like all the links, no, between Italy, Tuscan scholars, and Britain. Tommaso Crudeli actually was like the first person persecuted for Freemasonry in Italy. But it is nice because we have like these records concerning the trial, which are nowadays conserved in like in the Vatican State in the secret archives. I mean, the archive is like secret, but the records are accessible. So it is nice because there is like this letter from the Tuscan Inquisitor to the Grand Duke, in which they say, I'm sorry, in which he says, okay, so if we cannot persecute Stosch, just tell us who is like, let's say, able to be persecuted, because Stosch was protected by British. So Tommaso Crudeli, he was like a poet, he was a lawyer. Basically, he was no one. So he was elected as the victim of the general trial, the only victim. Then Antonio Niccolini, once again, as I told you, and Philipp von Stosch. It's nice because Antonio Cocchi used to have this diary called Ephemeridi, which means like about everything, no? Let's say. And these diaries are today preserved in the University Library of Florence. And I made two pictures of like 2 pages in which we can see like his admission to Freemasonry. This is like the first record that like talks about an Italian Mason. He's from like 4th of August 1732. And so the first document attesting the existence of a Masonic lodge in Italy. And as you can see, I have like underlined 2 words. So on the left side, there is like these old words, but actually I made a mistake, because you have to know that like I made many mistakes, as you can see, like when I try to speak in English, but just think about that. Antonio Cocchi was like one of the first Italians knowing English. So he was able to speak and write in English, but he made like many mistakes. Indeed, like many linguists have already studied his diaries because of this, but he wrote like Holdsworth, but actually he was referring to Barrington Goldsworth, who was like the consul of Britain in Ligorn. So basically, he was like initiated into the Freemasonry at the house of the British consul in Ligor, but in this case in Florence, where was present also Baron Stosch, that you can read like in the second image, which I have underlined. So I think that I gave you like this overview about Stosch, his activity both as a spy and both as an art collector. And so what? Stosch was able to amass a vast array of informations, but not all information, also about like artworks. So his collection was a true museum, and it became like a destination for all those travelers and all the scholars that were passing through Italy, both when he was in Rome and when he was like in Florence. So his collection was actually made of like 3 main assemblages. So first one, the library. The library consisted of more than 4,000 titles with many manuscripts, as you can see. 2 catalogs of his library were published in 1758 and the year later, because I remember you that he passed away in 1757. So most of his volume entered the Vatican Library inside the Ottoboni collection, because it is nice to see that like in many cases the clergy and priests always condemn these people, but actually they love like their books, so they love like reading. So basically it was like the prefect of like the Vatican archives that ordered the acquisition of the most part of his collection. And other volumes ended up in Florence, in the Riccardiana and in Maroscelliana libraries. And I put like this little image. This is like the ex libris. So basically the little sticker that he puts like in his books in order to recognize them as part of his collection. And this was, of course, his coat of arms, because he was a baron. So it was noble. Then the second like part of his collection is like the gem collection, more than 3,000 items. And this collection was described by Joachim Winkelmann. Winkelmann was like one of the most important art historians of the 18th century. And once he came to Florence, he came to Florence the year later that Stosch was died, and he stayed at Stosch's place for 6 months, and he listed all the items that he had. So basically, this was like one of the first and most important work from Winkelmann. Winkelmann dedicated this work to Cardinal Alessandro Albani, as you can see like from the name in the middle of the frontispiece. So once again, the link between Cardinal Albani and Philipp von Stosch, also because Winkelmann once described like the Stosch collection went to Rome and he became Albani's librarian. And then Frederick II of Prussia, he was like a very well-known art collector, both like the most of this collection in the mid-60s for his antique temple. So basically the temple that he built up at his residence in Potsdam at Sanssouci Palace. Then I promise this is like the last slide. And so the sulfur impression collection, because I told you that he used to not only collect but also produce these items with the collaboration of his manservant Christian Dan. Christian Dan later on became a very well-known art collector himself, and this is like the frontispiece of the publication by Francesco Maria Dolce, who was like an antiquarian in Italian, which is like dedicated to the Society of Antiquaries of London. So that's why I have underlined. And basically, yes, this collection was purchased by James Tassie, who was like this Scottish gem engraved and also like a collector. And so this was just to let you know how we can find nowadays Stosch collections. And that's it. Finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riccardo, for a fabulously informative lecture. We do have a little time for questions. We'll take questions both in the room and online. If you're in the room, please wait for the microphone to ask your question in person. If you're watching online, please type your questions into the chat and they will be picked up. Thank you.
Riccardo, it's a fascinating talk. There's so many levels that you've brought to our attention. But to me, the missing piece of your argument is, where does the money come from? His first publication, he is described as the Maecenas. Where does his money come from?
It's money.
His money. Where does his
we have like the calendary treasure. I mean, we have like many records in the National Archives through which we can see that he was paid with a pension around like £400 per year by the British government. So he used like most of his money in order to collect this information and to pay other informal agents. So he was actually paid by the British government. Did I don't know if I answered to you.
Pay him enough to become such an enormous collector of authority. I mean, the first book is when he's in the Hague. He's not there.
No. Actually, it was published in Amsterdam, but it was in Rome because. Yeah, sure. Because actually, he was able to collect like many items once his finances were grown because of this role as like informal agents. So he collected like most of the items after 1722. But we have like the all the payments, all the warranties that he had received, which are now collected in the National Archives, through which we can follow his payments. And so, yeah, he had like the money enough to have this. And also because if we speak about like the marble bas relief, he was purchased at a very low price, at bargain price, but Pier Leone Ghezzi, also because there was like a sort of inflection of these things, because this was like the very first moment in which in Rome there were like freshly excavated artworks, so the prices were not so high. So that is why he was also able to collect things, because he had like this pension from the British government, and also because the prices were not so high. And even like, for example, Pier Leone Ghezzi, we have the recipes of his artworks in the Biblioteca Casanatense in Rome, and he was paid not so much by Stosch because they were like all emerging artists. So basically, they did not like ask so much for an artwork. This is what I know, this is what I am aware of to try to answer back.
We have another question here.
Thank you for a most interesting talk. I've actually made a few notes, which is most unusual. Having said that, what condition did you find the books in? Because we went on a trip recently, and when we were at the Farmer collection, which is supposed to be world famous, the condition of the books was so poor and worm-eaten that I thought to myself, what on earth can they boast of this collection for? So how did you find the quality and the care given to the collection?
The quality is very good. I mean, all the books that are nowadays in the Vatican Library are very well preserved. Also, like all the records in the National Archives and also in the archival states in Florence are in a very good condition. So this is like very good also for me so that I can read it, first of all. But actually, I think that there are like no problems about like conservancy of these items. I mean, all the collection that I have accessed since the very first beginning of my studies, I have never found like something which was not even able to, that I was not even able to read or to manage. So, yeah. And also, if I come back to the sir, it is nice because actually we have like many records that talk about like these gifts that they used to make to each other, like cardinals and Stosch, because actually Stosch was great because he was always like in a good place, in a good time. So he was loved by these cardinals, by these politicians. For example, Cardinal Albani gave him like many items from his own collection without making him pay nothing. I'm sorry, I just wanted to, because I was thinking about this.
Do we have any online?
We have a couple.
Thank you very much. As a retired librarian, it's always interesting to read, to hear about books and to hear about their distribution. You showed on the screen a photograph of the catalogue of his works that ended up in the Vatican Library and in other libraries. Have you analysed his own library as reflected within that catalogue to show his interests and how many and what percentage of that are banned books that he'd been importing from Northern Europe?
Yes, thanks for the question. I mean, it's very nice, and yes, I did. Actually, because I would like to dedicate one paragraph of my dissertation about like his library, also because I used to work as a librarian, so I love books as well. But actually, I made some notes here that I forgot to say to you, so this is like the occasion to say that. Most of his library, most of his books were history books. So 1,173 items from history. He loved history, both from the classics, so Greeks and Latins, and also from like modern historians, especially Italians, because actually he was like very into antiquities, so about this excavation and discoveries, I'm sorry. Then at the second place, we found like poetry with like almost 6,000 items. And then English and German literature with like more than 500 items. So actually it's nice because it was like a mix of ancient history, modern literature, so French, German, and English as well. And also it's nice because he had like many, newspapers and pamphlets. So basically he was like one of the first, at least in Italy, because I know that you have like many collections of like pamphlet, which are nowadays even accessible online in many British institutions. But in Italy, it was like one of the first that actually collected minor publications, so like newspapers and pamphlets, which otherwise would have been like, I don't know, missed somehow, because are like items of 3-4 pages, no? And also we have like many books from Spinoza. We have like the Treaty of the Three Impostors, that was like one of the most important book about the spreading of the Freemasonry, and also banned books. He was like in contact with Charles Levier. He was this publisher in Amsterdam, member of the Chevalier de la Jubilation as well. And also he imported like many books from the Low States. And yeah, so that's it.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, time has defeated us. Can I just flag up our next lunchtime lecture will be on Tuesday, the 4th of March at 1 p.m. as usual. And this will be Genetic Histories of Kinship and Ancestry in Roman Britain, and will be delivered by Dr. Marina Soares de Silva. Of course, our full event program is live on our website and bookings are open. All our lectures are free for anyone to join. If you can show your express your pleasure for Riccardo once more. Thank you all for coming.